In the first part of this lesson series on the scientific worldview, we learned a little bit about the history of the universe. We had the Big Bang, producing all the matter and energy in the universe. Huge clouds of hydrogen condensed to form galaxies and stars within those galaxies. Stars can explode, and as they explode, heavier elements are produced, and those heavier elements are incorporated into another generation of star-forming systems, and so we get a solar system with rocky planets, and on one of those planets, life emerged. So this is an incredible story that science tells. It's one where the laws of nature produced new and more complex things in the universe. The Big Bang early on produced hydrogen and helium atoms. These were the simplest atoms that emerged out of the cooling, expanding universe. Clouds of hydrogen and helium condensed to form galaxies and stars within those galaxies. Within stars, heavier atoms are produced. And those heavier atoms are the components of rocky planets. And on one of those planets, life emerged. Well, all of these things here in this list, they all emerged over time from simpler things that existed before. So there's been a cosmic evolution that preceded the evolution of life on Earth. In this lesson, we'll pick up this story with the evolution of life on Earth and Mr. Charles Darwin, who helped us understand this process. Now, Darwin didn't have much to say about the origin of life. He surmised that it may have happened in some warm little pond somewhere long ago. But he did profoundly change the way we view the biological world. In his landmark book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, he's going to make one long argument against the special creation hypothesis. These were the ideas of the Christian thinkers like William Paley. He is going to reject fundamentally many of the ideas that the Christian thinkers had. You'll recall that a praying mantis has 4 limbs with these spikes, and these spikes help to keep the prey secure. So they are parts with purpose. They are adaptations of the mantis. Now, the Christian thinkers argued that the spikes were designed for a purpose and then constructed by an intelligent being, the Christian God. Mr. Darwin's going to come along and propose a radically different idea. He suggests that perhaps the ancestors of mantises did not have spikes on their forelimbs. But through the act of reproduction, sometimes there are new experiments, as it were, new variations. The offspring look a little different than the parents. Well, imagine an offspring that did have spikes. Now, when that offspring that had the spikes, when it went to capture prey, it found that it had a better time. It was easier to keep hold of the prey. And so in a sense, then, Darwin's going to reverse the process that the Christians thought were happening. Darwin's going to say that the spikes, are sort of made first by experiments with reproduction, and then the mantis, in a sense, discovers that it serves a useful purpose. So in a sense, the purpose comes second. And this is the reverse of the Christian thinkers. Recall, the Christian thinkers believe that God first designed the purpose and then made the part. In a sense, Darwin is saying the parts come first, and then if they're useful, they achieve a purpose second. Now, the key idea here is that this part may or may not be helpful, but if it gives an advantage to the individual, the spikes, if that's an advantage over other mantises that don't have spikes, then the mantises with the spikes will have a better chance of surviving. And if that part is heritable, if it could be passed on to offspring, then you see the potential for species change over time. So Darwin's going to argue that nature experiments through reproduction, which produces variation in organism construction. Now, Paley might have had a sort of a theoretical comeback here. You might say, well, if nature experiments, where are the individuals with no spikes? Why don't we see mantises with no spikes? And Darwin has a theoretical response. Nature does occasionally make individuals with no spikes, but they are more likely to die, so we don't see them. Right, so for the Christian thinkers, they sort of perceived species as being designed by God, and they have never changed. All mantises at all time have had spikes. Darwin's saying this is a kind of illusion. We can't see the ancestors long ago and exactly what they were like. And Darwin's arguing it's possible that these spikes emerged from limbs that didn't have spikes through this process of reproduction that experiments with body plans. This process whereby mantises with spikes survive better than the mantises without and therefore pass on that useful trait, Darwin called this natural selection, the differential survival and reproduction of individuals with different traits, right? And those traits, if they're useful, they're going to be helping individuals survive as they compete with others with different traits. Now notice then, natural selection is going to be Darwin's argument for the origin of purpose. Parts with purpose arise from the action of this process of natural selection. You don't need an intelligent mind to create something that has a purpose. The principal metaphor that Darwin invites us to think about is the tree of life. We can think about the history of life like a branching tree, where the root of the tree would be the origin of life, and as time goes by, living things were evolving and species were multiplying into the millions of species that we see today. So the tips of the branches would be the species today, and species therefore have common ancestors at different points in the past. This is one of his few diagrams in his notebooks showing this idea of a tree and common ancestors diverging into multiple species, and he writes, "I think," above his diagram. In his book, this is one of the few actual diagrams in his book. Again, this tree idea. Now here's a simplified tree, and we'll use this simplified tree to illustrate some of the differences between Darwin and the Christian worldview. So let's take our three species again. We've got the giraffes, the chimps, and the humans. Now Darwin is going to reject the Christian idea that species have an essence. You'll recall the essence was sort of like God's design plan for a species. Darwin will reject this. Species do not have an essence. In fact, species can change over time. Remember, the idea of an essence meant that species could not change. The essence, the defining features of a species couldn't change over time, said the Christian. Darwin says, well, the species do change, so they must not be having an essence. Species have common ancestors in the past. So humans and chimps had a common ancestor that was neither a human nor a chimp, and that ancestor is now extinct. So the idea is that this branching point of this tree here would have been, at some point in the past, one species. And as time marched forward, that one species split into two separate species, one of which is today's common chimp, and the other is our species. So notice then, in contrast to the Christian worldview, for Darwin, the lines of ancestry converge in the past. So too with the giraffes. So there's a common ancestor for all three of these species at an earlier point in time. So this species here in the past was the common ancestor of these two species. And this branching point here, this species that lived down here, would be the common ancestor of these three species. Notice also again the difference here. Chimps were not always chimps. Humans were not always humans. Humans did not always exist, and this is fundamentally different from the Christian worldview. Recall, the Christian argued that chimps always existed as chimps, all the way back to the mind of God. Once the first chimps were made, they kept making more chimps through reproduction. Same with humans, Adam and Eve in the Bible. In Darwin's view, there was a time when humans did not exist. Chimps did not exist. The only species that existed down here was the common ancestor species, which later split into the two species we know of today. So reproduction experiments with body plans, creating variations that are subject to the process of natural selection. Useful variations are preserved and improved and become adaptations over time. So the reason these two species are different is because there were different circumstances of living. Different kinds of traits were favored in their respective environments, leading to two different kinds of species. These two species evolved different adaptations. And we'll see later in the course what were the conditions, what were the living conditions that favored such large brains, for example, or a moral capacity, those kinds of things that are uniquely human. As time moves forward, one species can multiply into two distinct species, each with unique adaptations to different living conditions. Again, it's this idea of species multiplication, but they don't multiply and stay the same. They're multiplying as they become different. So it's this process of natural selection, Darwin argues, that has the power not only to create adaptations in individuals of one species, but to create multiple species from one common ancestor species. And importantly, evolution is a natural process, a non-intelligent process. Natural selection is the origin of purpose in the universe. And this is in contrast to the Christian worldview, where purpose was the result of the action of an intelligent mind that designed parts with purpose and created them. So Darwin's basic idea is species do not have an essence, rather they change in a process called evolution. As evolution proceeds by natural selection, species become more fit for their local environment. Individuals possess adaptations, that is, the parts with purpose. And this process is a natural process, no intelligent mind guiding the process. Any two species on Earth had a common ancestor at some time in the past. Species number multiplied over time from a single or a few original species to the millions that we see today. Now, later in the course, we're going to examine Darwin's ideas more closely. But again, in this introduction, we're just going to suggest that Darwin's ideas do provide an explanation to some of the puzzles that were facing naturalists in the 1800s. For example, species origin, diversity, and number. A key concept for Darwin is going to be natural selection. Operating in diverse habitats has the power to create new species and multiply species over time. And if that process has been going on for a long time, you're going to get lots of species. The appearance of design, the adaptations in living things, is the product of natural selection. It has the power to, in a sense, produce purpose, parts with purpose. Species extinction, disappearance, environmental changes happening too fast for natural selection to equip a species to survive. The groupishness of organisms has to do, says Darwin, with common ancestry. Two species that have a recent common ancestor are going to be very similar. There hasn't been a lot of time for them to evolve differences. The human origins and uniqueness, well, why do we have certain characteristics? Well, our species has a unique evolutionary history, just as every species has a unique one. But we'll inquire as to what were the conditions that led to some of our unique qualities. And aging and death, from the biological point of view, this is not the result of human sin, but rather aging and death, in a sense, evolved. It has a natural history. It evolved long ago in a certain evolutionary context. And again, we'll try to figure out what was that context. So if we just look at the differences between Paley and Darwin, they are profound. For the Christian worldview, they understood species to have an essence, the design plan in God's mind. And so as a consequence, species could not change. The lines of ancestry were parallel. Giraffes always made more giraffes. Chimps always made more chimps. Same with humans. And of course, there's an intelligent mind that is driving this process. By contrast, in Darwin's view, he argues that species do not have an essence. They can change over time. The lines of ancestry converge into common ancestors, and there is no intelligence guiding this process. It is a natural process, and we will dig deeper into that natural process later in the course. And so the scientific worldview has profound implications. By this process of cosmic evolution and then the evolution of life on Earth, we really do live on one strange rock in one strange universe. And the implications are some of the following: that this process was an all-natural process. No God was necessary. Order and complexity arise without intelligent guidance. And that's in contrast to the Christian worldview. In addition, there's no meaning or purpose to human life. Even though natural selection creates parts with purpose, See, selection can create parts of purpose, but not a purpose for a human life. Whereas the Christian worldview provides meaning and a purpose to a human life, right, as it relates to God the Creator. Thirdly, death is a consequence of the struggle for existence. So we will learn that when we study natural selection, that the context of natural selection is massive amounts of death. And this sets up a situation where individuals with useful traits better than others, individuals that they're competing with, they have an advantage. They will survive, but it means others will die. So death is a consequence of this natural struggle for existence that takes place on earth. It is not the result of human sin, as the Christians would say. And fourth, we are just another kind of animal. And that's a humbling recognition. Although we are a very special and powerful animal, we are just one of the many kinds of species that have evolved on Earth.